segment, I want to talk about globalization and multilingualism, but just to touch on one more aspect of what I talked about in the last segment, I wanted to give you a personal anecdote about language variation in France. I was in France in southwest France for a wedding reception a few years ago. We were at a restaurant, and I kept hearing French in the neighboring table that didn't sound quite French to me. Finally, I heard what I realized was the patois in that region. It was older speakers still speaking the patois, not the standard French. And one of the phrases I heard was todas las personas. They probably didn't pronounce it that way. That's sounding Spanish. Rather than toutes les personnes. In other words, they were closer in southwest France, in that particular phrase, to Spanish. They were not that far from the Spanish border, than they were to the standard French, which was associated, of course, with northern France, as I've said. So as you travel, in fact, that's a great place in the world to notice that as you travel from France to Spain, the language becomes less French and more Spanish. If you travel from France to Italy, the same thing will happen. So it's really dialects all the way. At any rate, this tells us, this kind of thing tells us that language diversity has always existed. It's natural. People want to be different. People also want to be the same, but there's this impulse to distinguish, and groups will distinguish themselves from each other, and this is how probably regional dialects and other dialects emerge and are maintained because they're linked to particular identities. Nowadays, that's always been the case, and we just haven't recognized it because of our beliefs that we should have one nation, one language, etc., as I've said. Now with globalization increasing each decade, we have even more obvious multilingualism. I think we're in a new historical period here. Globalization, of course, is defined as circulation of ideas, goods, people, and languages. And what I would argue is this is intensifying all the plurilingual practices that have always been there. There's a new centrality of language within the global economy. Many people are speaking English who are not native speakers of English. There are as many speakers of English as a second language in the world, or as a non-native language in the world, as there are native speakers of English in the world. So there are that many people in the world speaking English who didn't learn it in their homes and from their parents. That has become a global language, although some people are arguing that Chinese and Arabic are also global languages in their because of the numbers of speakers who command those languages. Anyway, language is very important because we have to use it to communicate with each other. It is interesting to note, though, with global English, there are varieties of global English, so that people take English, yes, they learn it if it's not their native language, and then they make it their own. There are a lot of studies, for example, on Indian English that describe the phonology and the grammar, and and it's recognizable as a world variety of English. All of this globalization, multilingualism, people moving around the world, undermines this traditional link between one nation, one language. It's happening more and more. And these ideologies of monolingualism and language standardization are increasingly questioned and contested. It really disrupts, ultimately, because of the link between language and identity, ultimately it disrupts the link between ethnicity and nation. Certainly between language and ethnicity, but also between ethnicity and nation. So, we are in a new historical period that undermines some of these language ideologies that I've been critiquing, and that instead is going to, I think, increasingly value multilingualism. If you speak a little Spanish, a little Chinese, you will do better than if you speak There is an intensity of contemporary migration that is rather astonishing. Moyer and Rojo, in a chapter they wrote, indicated that 1 in 35 people worldwide is an international migrant. I mean, no longer can we say only French people live in France, for example. We know that. But most countries, at least in the larger countries of the world, are multi-ethnic. So because of this, monolingualism is no longer sustainable as a condition for citizenship. In some places it has been. You have to speak the language to be a citizen. What if you don't speak the language? Well, I told you in reality what's happening is that polling places and governments are sending out notices that are in 5 languages, so people will vote. So you can be a citizen and prefer to speak in your home language, although in my experience and in most studies, everybody learns English eventually, at least over the generations. The real problem is maintaining the home languages, and we've lost many, many languages in the United States, unfortunately. Not only is monolingualism no longer linkable easily to citizenship, but identities are. So multiple identities, and now even multiple citizenships are possible and happening more and more. Both the U.S. and Mexico now, U.S. has for some time, Mexico now also allows dual citizenship. So you can be a citizen in both countries. I have done studies of transnational families, and I know that transnational students experience varying identities. They're neither, depending on context. Sometimes they're more Mexican, in the case of the people I've studied. Sometimes they're more American. And this has also been true historically in the U.S. Most of us have immigrant ancestors in this country, and this was actually just hidden in history. This has actually been the case all along. For example, if you consider students in schools, and you have kids who have a Spanish last name and seem Latino or Mexican, Puerto Rican, etc., the assumption is often made that they speak only Spanish. Well, in reality, that's not true. Some second generation, third generation kids do not know Spanish at all. Most Latinos in the U.S. do not know Spanish, either anymore if their families have been here, or they are just not keeping up with Spanish because English becomes so predominant. Some people are even learning English in Mexico. This is an emerging trend because of the importance of global English in tourism and travel and so forth. They learn from transnational relatives and friends who live in the U.S. and then come back home. They also, when I asked one young man I know in a rural village in Mexico, how are you learning English? I thought he would say his cousins when they came back from Chicago. He said, no, the internet. I'm picking it up on the internet. So there is a learning of English in Mexico. So when some people come here, they might already know some English. Some people from Mexico might speak an indigenous language and not know Spanish, even though they have a Spanish last name. I remember one time hearing from a teacher in Chicago that was actually a supervisor, that there were students in classrooms in Chicago that were from Mexico who were put into bilingual education, which presumes Spanish knowledge, but they didn't speak Spanish. They spoke indigenous languages, Native American languages from Mexico. That was a real problem for them. You can see how education would not work. I have a slide in the PowerPoint that shows you all the indigenous languages of Mexico just to show you the variety, but I can't show you that here. They are dying out, unfortunately, although there are some indigenous language revival efforts, both in Mexico and in the United States and worldwide, actually, for people to save their languages. In the U.S. educational context, most of the kids who come to the classes speaking whatever their home language is, if it's different from English, are faced with the transition from an oral, informal Spanish or whatever home language they speak to English literacy, academic English, the academic register. So that is a huge jump from an oral, informal home language, basically, to a educated written register of English, of another language. I would argue that there's a need to develop these students' home languages. If you stop developing your home language at age 5 or 6 when you go to school, you will speak a 5 or 6-year-old Spanish your whole life. And I think that for the sake of the country, it would be nice to develop all these languages so that kids could be not only bilingual but biliterate, so they could control academic Spanish. I have known people who are Spanish speakers, who their L1 was Spanish, try to take Spanish courses at the university. They can't handle them because they don't have that level of development in their home language. Then, as I said, if they did have it, they would be biliterate as well as bilingual. It's also a fact that oral, informal English can be learned much more quickly in 2 or 3 years than can the academic register of English, which takes 5 to 7 years to learn and actually control. Most bilingual programs are much shorter than that, so we're not really serving these non-English speakers very well. They will not have time to learn academic English if we cut them off after 3 years. In Chicago, they still have bilingual education, but it's limited to 3 years. Well, 3 years is enough to pick up the casual English. It's not enough to learn how to compete academically in English. It's also been shown in many studies and argued that we should develop literacy first in the person's first language, that it makes a much easier transition. The whole idea of literacy and sound symbol correspondences is better if you start that in, especially for alphabetic languages, but first in your native language, then transition to the second language, both oral and the academic register. I don't have time to go into this, but dual immersion schools have been found to be the best model of bilingual education. This is a school where you learn both languages. The kids are immersed in both languages, and you have a mix of populations so that you have non-Spanish speakers, people who come from English-speaking homes, for example, learning Spanish at the same time that the kids who come from Spanish-speaking homes are learning English. As I said, it's found to be much more effective. We have some here in Columbus also, dual immersion schools. But researchers have also pointed out the power of English is absolutely overwhelming, so that even Spanish-speaking children who are in a dual immersion school will use English when they're talking to their friends because it's the status language, it's the powerful language. And then the real issue becomes Spanish maintenance. Do they know Spanish? It's very clear when some of these kids, if they're in transnational families, go back to Mexico. Sometimes the families move back to Mexico, and there are several 100,000 students now in Mexican schools who are actually U.S. citizens. They don't control Spanish. They're having terrible trouble in school because they don't know the Spanish, and they certainly don't know the Spanish literacy.